there is a perfect storm that hits in the 16th century that makes everything that we're going to talk about tonight possible. And that is the attempts to codify Jewish law into the Shulchan Aruch as we know it, that coincides with which major significant secular event or creation is the printing press, right? And it's important to appreciate in terms of the Maharal and his writing style and what's going on around him in terms of Jewish literature, that the printing press is a incredibly significant factor in terms of understanding the environment in which he lived. So the printing press in Europe became accessible to the masses, let's see in our timeline here, in about the year 1450. So that's Johann Gutenberg. So now just keep the following fact in mind. It's hard to keep these little details about dates in your head when you think about significant figures or whatever you're thinking about in history, but it's really, really simple. Rav Yosef Karo is probably the most significant halachic authority of Jewish history. Not saying the best halachic authority, most significant halachic authority in all of Jewish history. Born when? 1488, right? Which means that when Rav Yosef Karo is born, the printing press in Europe is only 38 years old. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't books, right? There were certainly books. How did people have books back then? They wrote them by hand. And how expensive was it to pay someone to sit and write an entire book for you? Very expensive. So who had books? Libraries and the wealthy, or libraries that were owned by the wealthy. Books were not as accessible as we have them, which is a theme that we spoke about to a certain extent on Shabbos Shuvah, in terms of the innovations of the Siddur and the Machzor as well. It's important to keep in mind. So Rav Yosef Karo was born in 1488. To give you a sense of the impact that the printing press had on Jewish literature, the first completed attempt of a Mikros Gedolos was done by Daniel Bomberg. Those who've had the chance to hear a wonderful presentation by Razi Chechik from here in the neighborhood, I heard from her a number of years ago about Daniel Bomberg. Bomberg finishes his, not the first published Mikros Gedolos, but the first printing press Mikros Gedolos, which Bomberg has his own imprint on, is in 1519. And then he sets his sights on completing Shas. And he produces the first template for Shas as we know it, Gemara, Rashi, Tosos, on a page that could be produced in a printing press in the year 1523. So again, for the purposes of our historical context, 1523 is probably right between the births of Bezalel's oldest son and his next oldest son, between his two sons, Chaim and Yehuda Leib. Just think about how interesting the timing is of this historic evolution. The Maharal and his brothers are born right around the same time as the first Shas is potentially mass produced. Yeah, Donald.
So isn't Yami sometime like there too?
Absolutely. From the Arizal, Yosef Karo, and Tzfat, we'll get there, right? So to a certain extent. The Ramah is born in 1530. He has a very different life than the Shulchan Aruch. So just very quickly, Rav Yosef Karo was born in Toledo in Spain in 1488. Good time to be born in Spain or bad time to be born in Spain? Very bad time to be born, in Spain. So you can imagine, what's the maximum amount of time Rav Yosef Karo lived in Spain without being a historian? 3.5 or 4 years. He didn't make it very long in Spain. He works his way to the Sephardic communities of Turkey, Istanbul, etc., until he makes his way to Tzfat, where he basically sets up shop in Israel. So he's born in 1488, lives a very long life. Rav Yosef Karo doesn't pass away until 1575, close to 100 years old, into his 90s. Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, is born in 1530. You will notice here the Ramah dies in 1572, which means he lives a very short life. So the Ramah and Rav Yosef Karo, who of course overlap with each other and become historically, comrades of Jewish law, pass away only 3 years apart. But that's because Rav Yosef Karo lives a very long life, and Rav Moshe Isserlis in Poland lives a very, very short life. So Rav Yosef Karo has a very interesting life story. His life story deserves a lot of its own attention. Rav Yosef Karo makes it to the land of Israel, and he devotes a tremendous, tremendous amount of time to the publication of the Beis Yosef. Okay, the Beis Yosef is the commentary that Rav Yosef Karo wrote to the Torah, to the Arba Turim. Before we get to the Shulchan Aruch does not yet exist. So the Torah exists, and that's the origin of this 4-volume code of Jewish law, even though the Torah is not decisive, but it's incredibly significant halachic work from a few hundred years earlier. Rav Yosef Karo sets out on a mission to contextualize all of these halachos as they are recorded in the Arba Turim. And if you read the Beis Yosef, it is an absolutely incredible work. And he brings you the Gemaras, and he brings you the Rishonim, and he brings his own opinions and other Rishonim as well, to really round out a full picture of what the Torah is talking about. He writes it, he edits it, he carefully makes sure that it's a big deal. It's a milestone. This will be, but in his own mind, probably the magnum opus of his career. And he takes this Beis Yosef, he sends it off to Venice, and he has it published volume by volume between 1551 and 1559. Okay, after he completes his Beis Yosef, well, let's say it this way. At the very same time as the Beis Yosef, as Rav Yosef Karo in Eretz Yisrael is writing his commentary on the Torah, in Poland, there's a young Talmid Chacham named Moshe Isserles who's doing the exact same thing. And right around the time that Rav Moshe Isserles finishes his commentary on the Torah, he gets a package in the mail or something like that. And what is it? Somebody beat him to the punch. And you can imagine how deflating of an experience. I happen to know a rabbi who the same thing happened to in a totally different context. He was hired by Masorah to write a book. ArtScroll is doing a book at the same time. They don't communicate with each other. He finishes his manuscript and he finds out that ArtScroll just put one out on the shelf. So this is devastating, but probably devastating on a whole nother level because of the time invested in this massive, work. And so when Rav Yosef Karo publishes the Shulchan Aruch, which is only 7 years later, once you wrote the Beis Yosef, anybody could write the Shulchan Aruch, right? You just have to do the first part. He's already figured out everything that's going on in the Torah. He's already organized all of the sources, wrote his commentary, wrote his opinions on everything, and he condenses it into a punchline, some of which is very much consistent with the Torah, some of it's a little bit different, but he condenses the whole thing into what he calls a Shulchan Aruch. And in 1565, he publishes the Shulchan Aruch that will change the way that halacha is studied for the rest of Jewish history. So the Ramah follows suit. He already adapted his work. He's not going to publish a commentary on the Torah after Rav Yosef Karo did that in Israel. So instead, he writes a Darkei Moshe, which is his own comments that mirror some of what the Beis Yosef is saying, but a little bit it's different. He shares where his experiences in Poland are different than the positions that are practiced in Israel. And then Rav Yosef Karo comes out with the Shulchan Aruch, and the Ramah comes out with his gloss of the Shulchan Aruch with his Hagot, with his notes. Now, here's just an interesting fact. How quickly does it become apparent to everyone? Usually Ashkenazim and Sephardim don't get along so well. So how quickly is it that we decide, whenever we print a Shulchan Aruch, we may as well put the Ramah with it? I would think that would take a long time until we got to that place. The opposite is true. By 1578, whenever you find a Shulchan Aruch, you find it with Ramah alongside it. That is an incredibly, incredibly fast process. Remember, these are two Jews, basically from two different generations, living in two different parts of the world. One that's in Tzfat, the other's in Poland. The one who's in Tzfat has never been to Poland. These two Jews don't know very much about each other at all. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, they certainly were aware of each other, but I'm not sure. It's a great question. The Ramah passes away in 1572. So the Ramah's his comments of the Shulchan Aruch are already a few years old by that point, but he's only been deceased for 5-7 years, and it's already obvious to everyone that this is a transformative halachic moment in Jewish history. And when you get a Shulchan Aruch, you get a Ramah with it, which is really very astounding. So the question I want to explore tonight is how well received was the publication of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah by their contemporaries? And the reason I want to pose this question is, of course, by now obvious, because we are studying the life of the Maharal, who is in his prime while all of this stuff is happening. He, of course, outlives them both, passing away in 1609, right? I think 1609 was the year the Maharal passes away, but he's living through this entire experience. So here's how I want to start. What I want to do tonight is show you two reactions to the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. The first is from Chaim Friedberg. Who's Chaim Friedberg? Anyone? It's a trick because they don't have last names, so it's a trap. He's the Maharal's big brother. We learned about him last week. That's just a trick question. So Chaim Friedberg is the Maharal's big brother. And then the second is, of course, the reaction of the Ramah himself. Now, why we're here to study the Maharal. We're not here to study Chaim Friedberg. So why are we starting with Chaim Friedberg? Who knows? So this is why the history is so incredibly fascinating. You really can't do this story without the history, okay? The Ramah has an interesting education, okay? He ends up in Lublin studying in the prominent yeshiva. In their day, in the second half of the 16th century, I was thinking about it earlier today. The best way to describe it is to say that Lublin was essentially the Lakewood of that century. That was the biggest, most prominent yeshiva where most of the yeshiva guys were probably going to study. Shalom Shachna was the Rosh Yeshiva, the son-in-law of the previous Rosh Yeshiva, and he was like, I guess you could probably say, I'm not a Lakewood person, this is not a Lakewood promo, but he was probably the Aaron Cutler of his day. Incredibly powerful, incredibly dynamic, incredibly politically influential. He ran the town, probably on every level. And he runs a tremendous yeshiva where he has a very specific kind of influence in the way that people study Torah. You go to Lublin, you study like you learned in Lublin. You learn Pilpul like they teach Pilpul the right way in Poland, not some guy who learns in Eretz Yisrael in one of those yeshivas. The real way to learn a sugya, they learn by Rav Shalom Shachna. Rav Shalom Shachna has a daughter. Rav Shalom Shachna has a daughter, and he, of course, is going to marry his daughter off to the most prominent guy in yeshiva. Who's the most outstanding bachar in Lublin in that day? Moshe Isserlis. Moshe Isserlis. So if Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, marries the daughter of the great Rosh Yeshiva, and that gives you a sense of who he was, but also the platform that he was instantly given by marrying into this family. Now the Ramah is a big player. So when the Ramah moves to Krakow and he starts the yeshiva, you got to go. This is the son-in-law of the Rebbe. It's a big deal. Okay, so the Ramah is a very significant person in this moment. Now, when the Ramah publishes his Torah's Hachatas, which is his first attempt at a halachic work, it's significant. If you're a Rebbe and a Rosh Yeshiva and you operate out of one of these big institutions in the big Jewish community, so you'll publish a halachic work and everybody has to get a copy. You can afford a copy now because they're not nearly as expensive as they used to be. So the Ramah is paskening shilos, kashrus, nida, mikvah, things like that. And he writes a sefer called Torah's Chatas, and he publishes it, and it starts to be readily accessible. Now, I meant to make this point before. One of the reasons the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah are so great is because they are so succinct. They're so effective in teaching halacha, relatively effective. But the perfect storm, as I began with, was the printing press. So maybe you don't have enough money to buy a Torah. Maybe your family, they don't have no such thing as a chassan shas in the 15th century. Right? I mean, maybe for the wealthy kids it was. But this idea that, for $1,000, you set him up and he'll have a shas for life, it wasn't like that. But now you have the two great authorities of the day, one in Eretz Yisrael and one in Poland, basically working together, right? Now you have all of halacha in one book. It's relatively affordable. Everybody has to have it, and they do. So the Ramah puts out a sefer called Torah's Hachatas, which is his first attempt at an independently standing, conclusive halachic work. And he publishes it, and everyone is reading it. And one of the people who objects to the mass production of a halacha work that will ultimately be bad for the Jewish people is Chaim Friedberg. Okay, Chaim Friedberg is the big brother, probably, of the Maharal. Grows up in the same house as he's Chaim ben Betzalel, and he gets sent to study in yeshiva. Where? In Lublin. Remember the story we saw last week that Bezalel was one of the siblings and the father sent all of them to yeshiva, but didn't send Bezalel? So just keep that story in the back of your mind for a second, because he's an interesting person. He leaves Lublin, he has his smicha, he goes to Germany, which tells you something about his career path and the Ramah's career path go in different directions. The Ramah stays in Poland because he's the son-in-law of a very prominent person. Chaim Freiberg goes west, which is, from an anti-Semitism standpoint, is not the right direction to be going in Europe. So he works his way back towards Germany. He becomes the rabbi in Worms, but he's the rabbi in Worms at a time I don't think he really wanted to be there. And then he goes from Worms to Freiberg, which is why he's known as Chaim Freiberg, where he serves as a rabbi for many years. One of the interesting facts that people were sharing about Rav Chaim Freiberg over the course of the last year was almost all of his svarim have the name Chaim, and that's his name. So he has a Musar Sefer and a Agada Sefer that's called Sefer HaChaim. And in the introduction to the Sefer HaChaim, he says that he was living in Germany, he was living in Freiburg, I think, or maybe he was in Worms at the time, and there was a pandemic. Which again, all these pandemic things didn't mean anything to us until 18 months ago. And now we're like, oh, him too. He's living in a pandemic in Freiburg, and he and his wife are trapped in the house. Quarantine, social distancing, no servants, no delivery, no anything. They're trapped in the house for 2 months, and they had no internet. So you just have to imagine. It's horrible, right? So Chaim Freiberg said, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I sat down to learn, and I figured I may as well write a sefer. So Sefer HaChaim he wrote in quarantine, which is just amazing. Well, this Sefer was not written in quarantine, but he gets a copy of the Torah Chatas, and he says, this is not the way it should be. And he writes a Sefer called Mayim Chaim with a famous introduction that's called the Vikuach Mayim Chaim, which means that this is going to be a polemic of epic proportions when he realizes that he wants to write something in opposition to the Ramah. By the way, on that page 2, you have 2 pictures. The one on the top is an artistic rendering of the Ramah, and the one beneath it is the artistic rendering of Rabbi Yosef Kar. Okay? So here I have Vikuach Mayim Chaim. Now I'll show you something interesting, because Chaim Freiberg he wasn't a nobody. He was a prominent Rav in multiple Jewish communities in Germany. He was a product of the great yeshivas of Poland. And how is he known to most people? You can see in the title page, which I just took a little block out of from these really old prints, right? He is Chaim ben Bezalel, Achi Agonim Meforsam, Rev Leva, right? Who is he? He's Maharal's brother. That's how he becomes known. And he's the big brother. It's probably not a compliment as far as he's concerned, but be that as it may, this is the Maharal's brother, okay? Now, I took 3 paragraphs. Whoever's sharing their screen, if you could stop, that'd be nice.
I think it's me. I'm trying to figure out how. Maybe I don't know. How do I get rid of it?
Okay. I just took 3 paragraphs. This is a 10-page essay in the introduction to Vikuach Mayim Chaim, which is solely dedicated to why the Torah Sachatas is a bad sefer and should not have been written, which is amazing. So I just took paragraph Beis, paragraph Zion, and paragraph Test, because these were the highlights that I wanted to touch on. This is Beis. You'll see that language kind of floating around. People should make their own food. They shouldn't let somebody else cook for them. You should work hard yourself in life. You shouldn't just paskin shilas because somebody else said that's what the halacha is. The kol shekain she'ena rotze lios mitzape al sifrei hamechabrim hachronim she'ein daito somech aleim lios mitzape al shulchan aruch shelahem. Don't mooch off somebody else's food. Don't just show up at their table and eat their dinner. But we know what he's referring to. Right? Why is it that halacha svarim didn't exist in this fashion until now? He says, because everyone agreed it was a bad idea. So who are you to come along and all of a sudden, after all these years, and start pasking halacha for the whole world? Harav Moshe Isserlis. Asher chiber sefer miyuchad al dina iser beheter v'karu Torah's chatas v'lo shas libo l'chol hadvarim ha'ila shekasafti. It's amazing that Moshe Israelis doesn't agree with me that the historical precedent is that the publication of halacha works is unacceptable. Ubilti safek lo hayal nelam mimenu. See, this 4 lines from the end of paragraph B. This is the punchline. Gamkin ki be'esh lamadnu yachad b'yeshiva sagona mufla Rav Shachna. You remember when we were both in yeshiva together in Lakewood, and we were both in the same shir? We were both in Lublin. We were both learning by your father-in-law, and we both heard the same thing in shir. Vishamanu mipiv. Hashar medur manachnu talmidav hifratznu bo pe'amim harbe sheyira lechaber v'lokol yachad kol dina yisr v'heter b'seder nachon. We said, Rabbi, you're such a good teacher. When we learn halacha with you, we know exactly what to do. You know what would be awesome? If you wrote a book, we'd all be able to keep kosher better. We asked him every year at the end of the semester, maybe you should publish a book. People would read it, right? And every single time, Rabbi said no. So first interesting fact in this story is that, as you recall from last week, Chaim ben Mitzala, Chaim Friedberg, was sent by his father to learn in Lublin. He is the chavrusa of the Ramah, learning in yeshiva at the very same time. At the time we learned together in Lublin. Where did the Maharal learn in yeshiva? We don't know. We have no record of any kind that he learned in yeshiva anywhere. And his brother was sitting across the table from Rav Moshe Israelis. So now Rav Moshe Israelis is in Krakow, publishing the Torah's Chatas. Chaim Freiberg is, hundreds of miles west, out in Germany. He finds a sefer and he goes, "Remember me? We were in the same shir." That's not what he said. Not supposed to do it. That's point number 1, which is really historically very interesting. Zayin, v'chol hadorish hora me'al sifrei ha'machadrim ha'achronim levad. This is probably the most famous paragraph in all of Vikuach Mayim Chaim. Doma la'ani shekibel tzedakah harbe me'ashirim harbe. The people who write these books, he says, are like schnorrers that go out very, very successfully collecting money. So they go around and they go to the fish guy and they say, "I don't have any fish. Can you give me a fish?" They go to the meat guy. "Can I have 1 brisket for Yontif?" They go to this. "Can I get some canned food? Can I get a challah? Can I this?" Right? And they accumulate tons of food. Mizeh tzfua, mizeh yaim, mizeh peros, mizeh begadim, mizeh mos. Ad shekivlu lo de machsoro. So the guy's got a full pantry because he's been collecting all day long. And then some other poor person with nothing comes by and he sees this person and he's so wealthy, his pantry's overflowing with food. He thinks that this schnorrer is the richest guy of them all. So he says, "You're so wealthy, I have nothing. Can you lend me something?" The guy's totally broke. He doesn't realize that the bread that he is borrowing is poor man's bread. It's tzedakah bread. He's just getting secondhand charity from his fellow poor person. So is the same with the wisdom of our day. It's also for those who appreciate the nuance here. The writing of Chaim Freiberg is really, really beautiful. He says these people they're taken from here and taken from there, and they think that they're geniuses because they all these piskei halacha, they're just borrowing money from the poor. He says, don't get so excited when you hear, Rabbi says, it says in this art scroll book and then that art scroll book, it says that. They don't know what they're talking about. They're just quoting from somebody else's lousy material. It's all no good. It's very, very strong. And then when he finally completes all of his critique of philosophically, it's not a good idea. Methodologically, it's not a good idea. I was in yeshiva with you. Rabbi said how to do it. All that personal, emotional, all that stuff. Then he says, but now let's talk about the content of the Sefer. And he says something really interesting about the Ramah. Those who study Shulchan Aruch even somewhat regularly will agree with this point. This is very true. First of all, he contradicts himself. I read the book. The book's not even that good, right? Sometimes he contradicts himself. You see, the Shulchan Aruch says, this is our minhag, and this is our minhag, and this is what we do, this is what we do. And the Ramah just paskins halachos in Torah Chatas. And he doesn't draw a distinction between what they do in Lublin and what they do in Krakow and what they do where. But forget about Israel, because the Yosef Karo will stick up for him. Who's not being stuck up for here? The Jews of Germany, the Jews of Freiburg. Minhagei b'nei Medinaseinu mi minhagei b'nei Mizrach. K'mokei huachar gadol lehodia chilufei minhag b'nei Ashkenaz mi minhagei Medinas Poland. Shem harav lo ratzu levatel minhago mipnei minhag Eretz Yisrael. If the Ramah is so obsessed with making sure that every minhag is true, he has to write comments on everything that the Shulchan Aruch says, because just because they do it in Tzfat doesn't mean you have to do it that way in Krakow. Kol shekein she'ein lebnei Ashkenaz levatel minhaga mipnei minhag Medinas Poland. Now, just remember for a second, what he's saying here is absolutely incredible and very charif, because, as I said last week, most of the Jewish communities that existed in Poland, what we call Ashkenazi Jews today, come from Germany, right? They're Chachmei Ashkenaz moving east. So what happens? The Shulchan Aruch publishes, this is what the halacha is, this is what we do in Tzfat. So the Ramah says, 100%, that's wonderful, but for the record, Ashkenazi Jews don't do it that way. And as we saw last week, we're already split, we're bifurcated. We're just Ashkenazim and Sephardim, right? No other distinctions as far as the Shulchan Aruch is concerned. So the Ramah says, we shouldn't have to do what they do in Tzfat, so I'll publish our minhag. Our minhag is to do things the Ashkenaz way. What's the problem? Who is the Ramah to tell you what Ashkenazi Jews do? Is that what they do in Worms? Is that what they do in Freiburg? It's what they do in Krakow and Lublin. It's not even Ashkenaz. The Ramah, everyone in this room would agree that the Ramah is the most significant Ashkenazic authority. On what basis? Because Ashkenazi Jews moved eastward. He's not really the representative of Ashkenazi Jewry. He's the representative of Polish Jewry. So Chaim Freiberg, his chavrusa from yeshiva in Poland, is out there doing God's work in Germany. Hello, I'm right here. And that's not the minhag. That's not the minhag where I come from. So don't tell me, no, minhag in this place. And by the way, here's what's amazing. If you study Shulchan Aruch today, it's not just Chaim Freiberg. If you do like me, teach between Mincha and Mariv, you teach a little bit of halacha. So I'll teach a halacha, Shulchan Aruch, Ramah, Mishnah Brura, let's say. Okay, so the Ramah says we don't pass the Shulchan Aruch, kachi minhagenu. The Aruch HaShulchan says all the time, not my minhag, all the time. So it's not the case that there are only two minhagim. And the primary issue for Chaim Freiberg is that the Ramah, in his opinion, is erasing any other competing Ashkenazi minhagim. He trumps them all because that's not what it says in Shulchan Aruch. In the moment, for the Jews of all those other communities who are offended by it, it's very offensive. So nowadays, let's say in a community like ours, but I didn't think of a good example in advance of this, but you have whatever the example would be. You have a halachic practice. The Ashkenazim do what Ashkenazim do. So how many real yeks are there in the RJC? There are a few good ones, right? There are. They're great people, right? And they do things a little bit differently. So what's the shul minhag? What's the Ashkenazi minhag? What should our minhag be? They're the minority at the end of the shir saying, by the way, that's not how we do it in my family, right? So nowadays that makes sense, because if 90% of us are B'nai Ashkenaz are used to practicing Ashkenazi minhagim, of course there's Sephardim in the room that'll follow the Shulchan Aruch, but they don't have to worry because he's first, he's authoritative, right? If you have Rabbi Yosef to stick up for you as well. But the German Jews, they don't have that representation because they got washed out by the Ramah, as far as most yeshiva students or Talmidei Chachamim would be concerned, and they're still fighting to maintain their minhagim. This is the moment in which it happened. And Chaim Freiberg, the brother of the Maharal, is kicking and screaming, saying, this is not good. It's not good philosophically, it's not good educationally, and it's not good in terms of Minhag Yisrael either. You know, and he fights the good fight, but he doesn't get so far. That's for sure. Okay, so this is Vikuach Mayim Chaim, the famous introduction of Rav Chaim Freiberg to his sefer, in which he then, picks apart each halacha in the Torah's Chatas and disagrees with the Ramah where it is appropriate. For what it's worth, the Vikuach Mayim Chaim was only published after Chaim Freiberg passed away. And when it was originally published, it was published without the introduction. Because by the time he passes away, the Ramah is such an authoritative figure that it feels so irreverent to publish a book in which a rabbi from Germany criticizes the Ramah so vehemently that they just didn't publish the introduction at all. But it's accessible in the Amsterdam version. This is the Amsterdam print from the 1700s. It's a digital copy is available online. You can read the entire introduction.
The whole book is a rebuttal of the Ramah.
The whole book is just that's all it is. That's all it is. It's just a, pound for pound, along with the Torah Schatas.
Was there like no shooting published before? Like,
So what is the difference between responsa literature and Sifrei Halacha? Because you're right. If we're correct, what we're saying is that there is a real significant revolution happening. So what's the difference? What's that? Okay, so first of all, someone asked for your opinion, not for the opinion. Codification of Jewish law is a very different business than asking for a psak halacha. Second of all, how do chuvos work? Most good chuvos svarim that we know of, you write to the rabbi, I stirred my cholent with a dairy spoon. What's the psak? So, people call me with this question and I say, well, it really depends. And they say, it's Friday afternoon. Can you just tell me, can we eat it or can we not? You get back these responsa letters, right? You ever read a tshuva of the Rashba, right? It took him 3 weeks to write it. It takes you 5 weeks to read it. So you get the whole sugya. The primary critique of these critics of the Sifrei Halacha is that the Sifrei Halacha are so succinct. There's no context. There's no sources. There's no anything. It's just like mutter usser, yes, no. That's not fair. Now, I should have mentioned this before. Chaim Freiberg's introduction is so interesting because who is the primary beneficiary of Sifrei Halacha? This, I think, is I've heard historians make this point. It's not my own idea, but I think it's a very fascinating one. Who benefits most from Shulchan Aruch? So I would have said what Sharon said. Who benefits from it the most? Like the average people. Average guy doesn't know any halacha, buys a Shulchan Aruch, and now he's equipped. That's not really true. Marty knows me very well. The rabbi is totally unequipped to paskin shilos. What happened? He went into smicha. He married the Rebbe's daughter. They say, this community would love you. He told a great joke on Shabbos morning, and they throw him there, right? Friday afternoon, the Eruv goes down. He doesn't know anything about Eruvin. Sunday night, there's a hole in the mikvah. He doesn't know anything about mikvah. What's he going to do? Okay, so you could write to the Rashba, and you could get back in 6 weeks. By then, you'll be out of a job. But if in your office you have this book that tells you exactly what to do, it only takes about 45 seconds to double check. I can't remember, right? Is it tonight or tomorrow? Just look in the book. It was incredibly useful. How ironic it is that Chaim Freiberg is out in the middle of nowhere, essentially fighting the good fight. He doesn't need a Shulchan Aruch. He is an incredible Talmid Chacham from an elite Jewish family. He's more than equipped to paskin shilos. Lots of his contemporaries, not so. I have books in my office that are very helpful. If you ask for them, I won't share. That's what keeps me employed. So I'm in that other camp. Chaim Freiberg doesn't need it. And he thinks it's a big mishal. I don't just need a book that says everything. And by the way, if you paskin just by the Shulchan Aruch, without any context, without any nuance, without any variables accounted for, how often are you going to get the halacha right? So it's good and it's not good. If you see how many commentaries and super duper commentaries were written on the Shulchan Aruch, what's the conclusion that you get? It's not entirely clear what he's talking about. The great Talmidei Chachamim of the next 200 years will debate constantly. Is that what he meant? Is that what he meant? Well, he didn't say that over there. It doesn't make sense. That's not what the Gemara says. So the more of a Talmid Chacham you are, the more you struggle with what this book is all about. Now,
was he accepted immediately? Was it said by everyone but?
it appears that many of the communities, and I would say, I don't mean this cynically, but I would say the Jews of Svat were very excited about Rabbi Yosef Karo's work. And I would speculate that the Jews of Poland were very excited about the Ramah's publication. He's the next hot thing. He's 38 years old and he's publishing these incredible works. They're very useful, very useful.
Why are you doing so much from Mishnah Torah?
Oh, okay, great, excellent. We'll get to the Mishnah Torah in a minute. Great.
Do you know whether most Jews most European Jews at that time already lived in Poland, or did they make this in Germany?
I think the answer is I can't say this as a fact. My assumption is that most of the Jews have gone very far east. You have big historic German Jewish communities that have 75 people in them, right? You don't have any Jews in Spain and Portugal, not that are willing to admit that they're Jewish, right? And then very few. And those communities are decimated by crusades and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are dominant communities. What's going on in Bohemia, what's going on in Krakow, what's going on in Svat, that's where the action is. There are Jews everywhere, but that's where the action is. Okay, now the Maharal himself, Chaim Freiberg's brother, right? We'll give him Chaim Freiberg some kavod tonight. He publishes Nesivos Olam, which is one of his great works, in 1595. And here you have a copy of some of it, the end of the 16th chapter of Nesivos Olam. On page 3, there's the Hebrew and the English. Now, what the Maharal does, which we won't have time to elaborate on fully, but what the Maharal does in chapter 16 is develop this whole theology about the relationship between hard work and Torah study. Essentially, I'm really boiling it down, but essentially, l'fum tzara agra. The harder you work, the more you invest, the better the Talmud Torah is going to be. And if you just, here and there, read one paragraph or digest something very quickly, it's not going to be good for you. The Maharal over and over again, one of the major themes in his writing, which is explicit in the Gemara, but the Maharal amplifies it many times over, is it's bad to be an Am Haaretz, it's worse to be a Talmid Chacham that forgot what they learned. Right? People who learn, they never chazer, they don't remember anything they did. It's terrible. Talmud Torah requires hard work and constant investment in order to really reap the benefits of what Judaism is supposed to be. HaTorah, we'll read through the Hebrew kind of quickly. You can read the English along as well. HaTorah kasher mora halacha l'maisa v'davar zeh roi shiyeh yosei min HaTorah asher HaTorah hi sichlis v'davar zeh hu HaTalmud shehu sichli u'mizeh roi shiyeh yosei halacha l'maisa. That halacha l'maisa, practical Jewish law, is supposed to emerge from the hard work of real scholarly Torah study. V'davar zeh bevadei kiyum ha'olam she'omid ala Torah. That's how the world survives. The world survives on scholars that are learning at the highest level, producing Jewish law as a product of their advanced scholarship. Ulefikach hatanoim shemar halacha mitoch mishnah heim mevali olam. Aval bedor hazeh. Remember, the Maharal is a very personal guy. In our generation, im hayu posken halacha mitoch mishnah hayazeh dai. If they would have just posken from a mishnah, I'd be happy with that. Ki mishnah he reishis l'talmud v'aschala elav. The Mishnah is, of course, the foundation of everything. Aval ein posken halacha mitoch mishnah she'asuya l'talmud ki hatalmud u'pirush mishnah. They're not poskening shilas from the Mishnah or the Gemara. Rak she'en poskim halacha mitoch hapsakim asher nischabru lehoros halacha lemaisa velo nasu lomodosam raf lifsok bahem. There's no learning involved. You get a little instruction sheet from the rabbi on how to do Erev Tafshilin before Yantif, and it says step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. There's no learning in that. V'davar zeh yoser rachok min hadas. It's unfathomable, says the Maharal, that someone would take out a halacha book and just read it and do what it says. That's not what Judaism is. I mean, for those of you who do that, kol hakavod, but not the Maharal. V'harishonim kim Elliot. Pay attention to this line. V'harishonim. I'm going to need your help in a second. I'm going to put you on the spot. V'harishonim kimo harambam zichron l'bracha v'hator zichron l'bracha. What did the Rambam do? Codified what? Which parts of Jewish law? Everything. What did the Torah do? Everything. What about the Rambam and the Torah? Afal gav shekam heim chibru hapsakim below biror. They too, remember, there's no context, there's no explanation, there's no anything. They just exposit it. Lo haya daitam rak lahoro sofa halacha va'asherhu olamitocha talmud. It's a very nuanced argument. They didn't want to paskin halacha, they just wanted to paskin halacha. What does that mean? They didn't want to paskin halacha, they just wanted to tell you, if you're learning the sugya, this is how it ends. I think that's what he means. Just to open a Rambam and read it so the Rambam can tell you what to do without any context. The Rambam's just trying to help you. You finish the sugya, this happens. You're in yeshiva, you learn a sugya for 4 weeks, and when it's done, you come home to your parents for Yantif, and they say, what are you learning? I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain. So you get to the end of the sugya, you've been on this daf for weeks and weeks and weeks, especially you're in middle school. Wait till the Maharal talks about this stuff. Guys who learn 3 daf above Mitzvah in a semester, you go crazy. So they learn it for months and months and months and months. And what's the maskana? What's the halacha? The Gemara never ends. The Gemara never tells you what to do. So the Rambam did you a favor. When you finish the sugya, open my book, and I'll tell you what really happened at the end. That's what they did. Lifso ka'adam mitocha mi belisha yedem izamakom yotze hadin rak hilchasa below taima, that you would open a Rambam without having any clue what's going on in the sugya, and then just paskin the shiloh without knowing the context. Lo Allah al daitam va'al machshavosam. It never occurred to them that you would just open a Torah or open a Rambam. They wrote this for yeshiva guys who are finishing the sugya. Conclusions. Shari Amrukana, posting mitocha Mishnah, nechshav gushi. This, Gemara we're not going to study right now. Look at the top of the second column. If they would have known that the publication of their books would have caused if they would have realized that people would forget the Gemara and just go to a Mishnah Torah class on the Rambam, lo hayu mechabrim usam. They never would have written them. Shiloh should be answered from the Gemara, not from the Rambam and the Torah or the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Elliot, come on. You don't have to read forward. What's wrong with this? Okay, even better than that. I thought you were going to take me to task before I finish the paragraph. Okay, I'm gonna do you a favor here, and I'm gonna show you something unbelievable. Does the Rambam agree with what the Maharal says about the Rambam? It's a machlokas between the Rambam and the Maharal about the Rambam. I just did it the last. I realized you had to see it because you wouldn't believe me if you didn't see it yourself. Go to the last page of your handout. I just stuck it on this afternoon because you have to. You have to read it. And then you could go back and you could understand why Rabbi Hartman has to put such long footnotes in his commentary. I'm not giving you the footnote version of the Maharal. If you want to read Rabbi Hartman, you can read it with all the footnotes. I'm just giving you the Maharal himself. I think 90% of the time, with all due respect to the incredible work that Rabbi Hartman does on the mysticism, 90% of the time, let the Maharal do the talking. Okay? Back page of your handout is the Rambam himself in his own introduction to the Mishnah Torah. And now, paragraph. And it's really blurry. I apologize. I did it the last second. Let's start with Lamed Zayin. The last 3 paragraphs on the page. I apologize. There's no English on this. Everybody has no time. No one has the money to go to yeshiva. There's no chachamim around anymore. Nobody's educated anymore. It used to be you got a tshuva from Rav Sadia Gaon, and it solved all your problems. Nowadays, you get a tshuva from Rav Sadia Gaon, and you don't speak Aramaic, and you don't know what he's referring to, and the print's no good, and you don't have time to study it, and you don't have a class inside, you don't know what it means. It used to be halacha was so easy, but now in my day, says the Rambam, it's so hard. How many people actually know anything? They can't understand what's going on in the Svardim. Forget about learning Bavli and Yerushalmi, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Tosefta, Shein Tzrichin Das Rechava, B'nefesh Chachama, Uzman Arach. You need to be a really good student. You have to have really good patience. You have to have a lot of free time in order to learn the whole thing. Only then will you actually get to the conclusion. And nobody can do that, right? This is hundreds of years before the Maharal and the Shulchan Aruch and Rav Yosef and Rav Moshe Isserles. Hundreds of years before the printing press. Even if you have a shas, the Rambam says there's no chance you're going to pass in halacha. That's not realistic. Lamed ches. Umepnei zeh na'arti chatzni ani Moshe v'Rabbi Maimon hasvardi. He's smart. All the Ashkenazim in the room. The Rambam's not yours. Okay. He says, I, Moshe ben Maimon, nishanti al atzor baruch hu binosi b'chol eila asvarim. I did you a favor. I spent some time learning. I read everything. V'ra'isi l'chaber dvarim ha'misbarim mikol elu ha'chiburim b'nim ha'isr v'ha'matar v'tamei v'atar im shar dinei Torah kulam b'lashon brura v'derech kitzara. I wrote down everything mutar aser kosher treif in very concise, easy to read, good language. Ad shetehei Torah shebal peh kula sedura b'pi hakol v'lo kusha v'lo peruk. He said, I there's no shiloh, which is again the irony. We're studying Rambam for 1,000 years and we're still debating it. Rambam says, you read my book, it's perfectly clear. I solve all the problems. Lo zeh omer b'cho v'zeh omer b'cho el dvarim perurim kirovim nechonim al pi hamishpat asher yisbar mikol elu achiburim v'apirushim animtzis v'amios rabbeinu hakadosh v'ad achshav. From Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi until today, I got it all in one volume. That's what the Rambam says. It's all done. But now that's not so, okay, that's bold. But the last paragraph is the kicker. Lamed text. Ad sheyu kol hadinim gluyim lekatan v'lagadol kedin kol mitzvah v'din kol mitzvah v'din kol dvarim shetiknu chachamim neviim. Now you read my book, you know everything the Torah, you know everything the chachamim said, everything the prophet said. Klalo shel davar. So here's the point. Kidei shelo yehi adam tzarach lechibor acher ba'ola. B'din midinei Yisrael. This is one of the most famous things the Rambam ever wrote. Just so you don't have to, Svarim are so expensive anyway. You can't get them nowadays. You shouldn't need, and I quote, Chibor acher ba'olam b'din midinei Yisrael. You don't need a single halacha book on any rule in Judaism. Ella yechibor zeh mikabetz l'Torah shebal peh kula. Im hatakanos v'haminhagos v'hagzeros shenasu mimos Moshe Rabbeinu v'achibor haTalmud. It's all here in my book. Lefikach. Mishnah Torah. Why do you think I call my book Mishnah Torah? Lefisha Adam Korei Torah Shebechsav Tchila. First, you learn Chumash, you learn Navi, you learn Ksuvim, you learn the Tanakh. Ve'achar kach Korei Bazeh. You could skip right to here. V'yodea mimenu Torah Shebal Peh Kula. You'll know everything. And you'll never have to read anything else ever again. So the Maharal told us on page 3. What did the Maharal tell us on page 3? The Rambam never would have told you to just read what he says and not look at the sugya. He wrote the book so that when you're finished learning Shas, he can help you summarize some of the key points. Not only is that not a realistic methodology, it's not what the Rambam says. Why were they burning Rambams everywhere? Right? There are many reasons why they were burning Rambams everywhere. But a way not to make friends is to tell people you shouldn't read the Gemara anymore. And the Rambam said it. He said, I'm cutting to the chase. Says it explicitly. So the Maharal here is taking a little bit of license in making his case. Yomina. It's fair to assume that the Maharal did read this introduction to the Rambam. I don't know. I just put them on the source sheet. You have to figure it out. I think this is very, very challenging. Very challenging. Sandra?
It's like those Zirkind show up.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's true. It doesn't solve at the end of the day. It doesn't solve the working assumption that not only was the Maharal well versed in Rambam, but he also read the introduction to the book. But 100% in terms of what he's doing, right? Right, and so here's the point: we're not here to assess. Right, we're not here to assess whether the Rambam made the right decision or the wrong decision. We're not here to defend it either. What's clear is that the Maharal in the 1590s is trying to distinguish between the holy, untouchable, amazing works of the Rambam and the Torah and this horrible thing called Shulchan Aruch. And the question is, what's really the difference between them? It's just two iterations of the same thing.
Who wrote this first? Him or his brothers?
I think his brothers was written first, but I'm not, I believe so. I could not find the original. I mean, it wasn't published. Very close. Publication dates are probably pretty close. Not sure. Not 100% sure. Maharal's not done because anything that really matters to Maharal comes up more than once in his voluminous writings. So if you turn to the next page, to page 4, you will see the Maharal's commentary to Pirkei Avos, Derech Chaim. Now, what I was thinking when I was reading Vikuach Mayim Chaim, so I was thinking to myself, when I was in I took Jewish history in YU with Professor Rosenzweig, Oliver Shalom, Rabbi Rosenzweig's father. And if I'm not mistaken, this was sophomore year, my first year on campus at YU. If I'm not mistaken, he was teaching about one of the Gaonim. When you read the Wikipedia biographies of the Gaonim, it's like, it sounds like an art scroll book. When he was 7 years old, he finished Shas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Gaonim, so when he was Sadia Gaon, whoever it was, had written a full treatise on Hebrew grammar at the age of 17. And Professor Rosenzweig looked around and he said, how old are all of you? We were all 19 and not even close, or whatever it was. So I read Vikuach Mayim Chaim. The guy publishes Sefer HaChaim while he's in quarantine. What did I do? I was at home for 3 months. I didn't even have to teach on Shavuos, my first year at the RJC. What did I accomplish? So I did accomplish one thing, which is I taught a lot of Pirkei Avos. Now, those who are with us, I should have written a book. I missed my opportunity because hundreds of years from now, coronavirus. What's the coronavirus? So when we study Pirkei Avos, those who are with us, we often study Derech Chaim, which is the commentary of the Maharal to Pirkei Avos. If you look in the last chapter, which is not really Pirkei Avos, but that's for the next pandemic, God forbid, chapter 6, Mishnah 6, Parak Vav, Mishnah Vav, the Mishnah says, Gedola Torah Yoser min HaKahuna umin HaMalchus. Torah is greater than the priesthood and the kingship. Shahamalchus niknes b'shlosha malos. You only need 3 attributes to become king. Va'kahuna be'esrim ba'arba. You need 24 attributes in order to be a kohen. Ve'hatorah niknes ba'arba u'shmona dvarim. And in order to be a Torah scholar, you have to do a lot more. You got to have all 48 of these attributes, and the Mishnah goes on to list them all. So the Maharal goes through each of these attributes of Kinyan Torah. What does it take to be a real Torah scholar? And then when it's all done, he finished. It's a very, very, very long essay. And when he explains all 48 features of a Talmid Chacham, then he says, let's get real. Let's talk about Talmidei Chachamim now, in Prague or today in Czechoslovakia. V'ha'emes v'ha'amuna. This is the first paragraph. Lo miyosi machzik atzmi kiroi ani lehochia. Maharal says, I really shouldn't be in the business of critiquing other people. I don't want to give off the implication that I have all these qualities and you don't. When I went to Shiva, I was nobody also. And he says that I myself see my own flaws, what's lacking in my own learning or what's missing in my own education. But here's, Jeremiah the prophet wailing about the destruction of the temple. The Maharal is wailing and complaining and screaming to anybody who will listen about the state of Jewish education in his day. Those who have the facilities to grow in Torah study might listen to me. You shouldn't just follow the way everybody else is studying Torah, because that's going to lead you in a terrible direction. So I wanted to highlight 2 paragraphs of this. Anybody who knows anything about Torah study, he says, realizes like Yirmiyahu said, it's a terrible time. People used to learn the normal way, says the Maharal. And how do people get taught in the 16th century, this horrible generation that we live in? How old do we start teaching Gemara? How old do we start teaching Gemara? 4th grade, 5th grade? How much Chumash do they know in 5th grade? How much Mishnah do they really know? Less than a parak. But we gotta get to Shnai Mochs and Betalis. We gotta start Bab Mitzia, right? Again, not a great way to make friends, to criticize every yeshiva around. But the Maharal does it anyway. 6 years old, 7 years old, they're already learning Gemara. And then eventually they get to Mishnahs. V'lo Lilmo, they're not actually learning Mishnah. They're looking for the punchline. They learn the sugya the whole time. They haven't even learned the Mishnah yet. So they're going back to learn the Mishnah to figure out what the conclusion is. Ever think maybe you should learn the Mishnayos before you learn the sugya? And maybe, by the way, if you learn the Mishnah first, maybe you'd remember it. The achshav lo nishar lo Talmud v'lo shum din v'lo shum hora rak ayidei k'pos. And now they go all these years to yeshiva, and it comes time to make an Erev Tavshilin, and they Google it because they have no idea what to do. That's exactly what you're saying, right? And then he goes again. There's a very lengthy essay. I'm only cherry picking the best parts. Amnam hasiba hagoremes hakilko. I got all there. Where did this all go wrong? Hu hasheker b'tchila yolid b'sof ha'ivus v'hakelkala. You have to start at the very beginning, at the roots of the problem. V'zeki maschilim lefalpel divrei havai v'halacha. Asher yodem kipihem lo chen yidaber. There's all this pilpul stuff that they're teaching the kid. Kal v'chomer this, k'zera shava that. What would happen if this happened? What would happen if that happened? U'megalim panam b'torah asher lo chen v'yomer lichidud ba'inan. Why are you teaching the kids a sugya they can't possibly understand? They can't possibly understand the sugya. Well, they have to teach them to have a Gemara cup. You have to teach them how to think like a Talmud Chacham. V'afki davar zeh chas v'shalom lo tehei b'Yisrael lichdudei b'divrei sheker v'lichlos hazman b'sheker. They spend their whole day saying stuff. It's all nonsense. None of it's true. They have no idea what they're talking about. V'atorah hi Torah's emes. Eich yale al das adam kazeh. Halo roi sheyikra adam levavo al zeh lahafech ha'emes al sheker v'yomer lichidud ba'inan. It's ridiculous. In the end of the paragraph, he says, I have a suggestion. Why don't we wait to do all the fancy stuff until the kids are smart enough to have any idea what they're talking about? Everyone's nodding their head. We all struggled our way through Jewish education. Nothing has changed, right? This is, which is very significant. Okay, Maharal is a very significant thinker, and he's yelling and kicking and screaming about the exact same problem. No one was listening then, and nobody's listening now. The Maharal developed what he believes is an entire different method of Jewish education. It's revolutionary in the sense that it is the most obvious way to teach. And he writes about this all over the place. And by the way, as I mentioned last week, he often speaks publicly in all these communities. The Rosh Hashivas in town, ask the Rosh Hashiva to speak. What does he do? He gets up and he's in shul and he says, I've never met a worse group of Jewish educators in my entire life, which is not a good strategy, right? It's not a good strategy. How do you think they felt? His brother comes from Lublin. He's the Chavrusa of the Ramah. He learned by Shalom Shachna, the greatest Rosh Hashiva of the day. And he says, I'm glad I didn't go to yeshiva there. All they do is waste their time with all this stuff, all this pilpul. It doesn't get you anywhere. And he says, that is the root problem. That at the end of the day, your kid has a Gemara cup and he has no idea how to pass in a shayla. It's all your fault. Which is really just absolutely astounding. Okay? Astounding. I know it's 9:05. So I want to wrap up. I'll do one question. Go ahead, Donald, and then I want to wrap up with one last point.
I was just going to say, as you say that, it seems to me like the difference between the Rambams is telling you like how to make an Erev Tavshilin. Here's where you look. How do you mask it? Almost too busy. Here's how you do it.
Right.
The Maharal's after. I'm not going to say something bigger. I won't do that, but he's after. How do you have a relationship with God? How does common
Excellent. Okay, so this is a very important point, which is. Here's a funny way to phrase that observation. What is the relationship between Jewish law and the way we live our Jewish life? One way to say it is that Jewish law is the way we live Jewish life. Rabbi, just tell me what to do. I don't care. I need to know right or wrong. If you are someone who sees the world through the lens of the Maharal, halacha isn't just about kosher or trait for tameh or tahor, but the practice of Jewish law is the conclusions of everything. It's my deeper understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's my relationship to God. It is a celebration of the accomplishment of all of my Torah study. The Maharal says explicitly, there's a wonderful article, I just forget the name of the author, a professor in Eretz Yisrael who made this point. The Rimigash has a tshuva about the Sifrei Halacha, or centuries earlier, in which he says, I don't really like Sifrei Halacha, but I'd rather people do the right thing than the wrong thing. The Maharal says explicitly, we didn't read it. I think we stopped right before it.
Yeah.
On page 3, top left column. I'm sorry I stopped too early. Page 3, top left column. Because he says, is he in the 4th line? I much prefer people make their conclusions not from the halacha, but from the Gemara itself. Even though if you're learning the sugya and you're not that smart, you're probably going to get the answer wrong. What's the right halacha? What's the right answer to a shaila? Is there an objective right answer? Or the right answer to the question is the conclusion I came to from doing my own research. There's smarter people in the room than me. They're going to come to different conclusions, better conclusions. I'm not that bright. I'm never going to finish the whole thing. At least I tried. In the theology of the Maharal, attempting to understand what I should do is part of the journey of Jewish practice. If I don't invest any energy in it, so what's it worth? It's a very dangerous kind of sentiment. Yeah. Right, so you can't even begin to have this conversation. I mean, the Maharal values all these svarim. He wants to learn them too, right? Because he doesn't have any problem with, you could study the Gemara and not sure how it's supposed to conclude. And then you could study the Rambam and the Ramban and think why they concluded in different ways. And then you can make your decision. This is what I think we should do. We should follow the Rambam or the Ramban. The Shulchan Aruch said, no. This is right and this is wrong. So according to who? That's your conclusion. It's not my problem. I'll learn the sugya and I'll come to my conclusion, which is drastically different. Yeah. Right. So Niskatnu Hadoros only works if you're looking for an objective answer. I'm not as smart as him. I don't have as much time as him. I'm not as well educated as him. So I may as well rely on his opinion. The Maharal cannot envision a world where all of the halacha I practice is what somebody else just tells me to do, which is, he's the Maharal, so you're fine. So he's different than you and me. But exactly. So the idea that two Jews on two corners of this Jewish world would just tell everybody else what to do is the antithesis of what Jewish practice should be according to Maharal. Okay, now we're over time. I'm just going to end with the following. I was thinking about doing the Maharal's approach to Jewish education separately, but I want to have time to do other things. Schools in Eretz Yisrael that follow the Maharal system, if you've heard of such a thing, this is where it all begins, right? Systems where they finish all of Chumash before they start Mishnah, they finish all of Mishnah before they finish Shash. They don't take summer vacation because if you don't class, anybody goes to Maharal school? Anybody? Samson, they exist. Such things exist. There's no time for summer vacation because the Chazara system, you can't forget anything you ever learned. It's a travesty of the greatest proportions. Okay, that's all very significant. But here's what I want to mention tonight because we keep developing. We'll go week by week. We'll add more to our picture of the Maharal. Who is the Maharal's most famous student? We're moving into the next generation, guys. All you have to do, he's his successor, not his student, but all you have to do is read page 5, is the Tosos Yantiv. Okay, Rav Yantif Liebman Heller. Who's Rav Yantif Liebman Heller? Well, he was a Talmud of, you can read all the bio here, we don't have time for it now. He is the Talmud of the Maharal, who is known most famously for his commentary to the Mishnah. Why do you think the Maharal's student, he didn't write a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, I guarantee you that. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. So let's do our last introduction of the day. We'll end with an introduction. If you look in the Tosos Yantif commentary of the Mishnah, written by the primary student of the Maharal, he says, why am I writing a book on Mishnah? Let me tell you. And he says something really bold. Really, this is for an Orthodox rabbi. This is very bold. This is the bold section, the source section in the middle of page 5. Some of it's available in the English at the bottom. Kishem Rabbeinu HaKadosh Rabbi Yehuda Anasi Shebiyamav Nishnis Mishnah Zu Ha'uskim B'Mikra Mida Ve'ina Mida B'Mishnah Mida V'Nolan Al Aschar. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi said you shouldn't spend so much time on Talmud. You should learn the Mishnayos that I wrote. Gemara in the Chamida Gedolim Mizu V'Shafku Kuli Alma Masisa and V'Azlu Basar Gemara. Nobody learns the Mishnah. Everybody learns the Gemara. Sounds familiar, right? Hadar Darshlu L'Olam Havi Ratz L'Mishnah Yoser Min Gemara. The Gemara says about Mitzia you should learn Mishnayos first. Kimo Kain, just like Rabbi Yehuda Anasi said this. Rabbeinu Hagadol Marana Rabbana Hagon Rabbi Yehuda Levi Bar B'Tzalel, my dear teacher, the Maharal. Shenis Asek B'Yeshiva V'Hirbitz Torah L'Rabim B'Mida Hagidola. He taught Torah at a massive scale. He midas Hagamarim for some. Hadar Darush Laratz LaMishnah. He finished all of Shas. He knew everything, and he told us we should be studying Mishnah. Achnis Chabru Chaburos Chaburos Kitos Kitos Malachi Man Malachi Rabbanan. He established Chevra Mishnayos all over the place. Everybody's learning Mishnah. That's our Rebbe's tradition. Misaskin Yom Yom Perak and Pirkei Mishnayos V'chosun Chalila Chalila. Not in a bad way, in a good way. This is what we do. If you look around Europe today, says the Tosos Yantiv, you'll see Mishnah groups learning everywhere. By the way, Mishnah groups didn't exist 100 years before because they didn't have Mishnayos going around. Everybody has a Mishnah, and they're all learning Mishnayos. Why is everybody learning Mishnah? Says the Tosos Yantiv, because that's what Rebbe said to do. Who's Rebbe? The Maharal. The Gadol Koach Mamaro Sharabenu Hagadol Mi Mamaro Sharabenu HaKadosh. He says our Rebbe's proclamation was greater than the proclamation of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi himself. Unbelievable. Back in the day, the Mishnayos were so succinct. You know, you learn Bikurim, you don't know anything about Bikurim, you learn Hadrashas Chala, you don't know anything about Chala. But nowadays, I'm skipping in the bold, in that middle paragraph. Halibadhu and Pirush mi Pirusha. Nowadays, there's commentary on the Mishnah. Nowadays, Mishnayos are so great. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's day, he said everybody should learn Mishnah, but nobody knew what the Mishnayos meant. Nowadays, you have commentary. So you could really study Mishnah. And everybody should study Mishnah before they waste their time with everything else. You can learn all Mishnayos with the art scroll. Now, parenthetically, the Bartanura was written a little bit earlier, Tosos Yantif, which is apparently, was supposed to be Tosefet Yom Tov, right? Which means in addition to the Bartanura, he wanted to tack on a little bit more. He didn't want it to look like Tosos, but it became called Tosos Yantif. You can really learn a sugya on a Mishnah. That's the whole purpose of the Tosos Yantif. That there should be chabura for Mishnayos. What's the Rashi? The Bartanura. What's the Tosfos? The Tosos Yantif. You could learn the whole sugya. So you could actually accomplish it. You could learn a little bit about everything in Judaism if you do a Mishnah every day. And we have commentary on it. It's very doable. That's exactly what Rebbe always dreamed of. And look at how he ends. V'hu asher madad mayim b'she'ol yadricheni b'nesiv ha'emes v'li mal u'nefutzos Yehuda yikabetz la'artzenu ya'al. This is poetically translated on Sefaria as follows. May he whose hand doled out the deep, my road to truth from swerving keep, and Judah's son from exile rest to dwell with them in Zion's breast. In other words, Nefutzos Yehuda Yekabetz Ulartzenu Yal. What's Nefutzos Yehuda? One day, everybody will study Mishnayos and the Mashiach will come because we're finally Talmudei Chachamim. But it's not Nekabetz Yisrael, it's Nekabetz Yehuda, because it's Yehuda Levo, his Rebbe's the Maharal. That's what the Medrash says. Ein kol hagoyos miskansos el b'schus mishnayos. Shenemar gam ki nu b'goyim ata akabzeim. Amen keni hiratzon b'mehir b'yamein. This is how the Tosos Yantiv concludes his introduction to Mishnah by saying, now the Mishnah is finally accessible. Our Rebbe's dream is coming true. If only we would take it to heart and study the Mishnah, who's to know, maybe the redemption would come tomorrow. So it's actually quite fascinating because at the end of the day, the Maharal's position is not the accepted one. I would say that the Maharal and Rav Chaim, his brother, are on the wrong side of history when it comes to this debate, but they represent two very important things. First of all, they help us understand the context in which Rav Yosef Karo and Rav Moshe Isserles became incredibly dominant in Jewish scholarship, with opposition of major rabbinic figures. They towered over all of them, including the Maharal, without question. But the second is, I think it really does challenge us to think deeply about how we study halacha and how we practice it. I would say that there probably is not a higher bar than the bar that was set by the Maharal, and it's unlikely, no matter how hard we try, that we'll ever live up to that standard. We will hold here for tonight, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to